Why do the markets love Donald Trump? What's so special about him? They are keeping an eye on his Twitters, every morning. Does he really have the impact, on the markets?
Yeah, this is one of the more unique presidencies that we've ever seen, I think, in U.S. history. I think the good things that Trump has done is he's been a very business-friendly policy environment in terms of trying to roll back some of the regulations. He passed through some of the tax cuts for incentives to invest in infrastructure and growth areas. And, he's kind of going around the world in every market trying to renegotiate a better deal. Obviously, he has his certain mantra about make America great again. And so a lot of his policies are very pro-business. And so they've helped, I think, the economic growth picture in the U.S. You've seen the U.S. markets be one of the best performing markets in the last couple of years. And he takes the stock market performance personally with his policies. And so I think he has been more controversial. How he goes about his communications is in a much different way than we've ever seen. He's using social media a lot for his communications, and I do think it has added a bit to the volatility in the market. But overall, on balance, his policies have been constructive towards the business environment, which I think is what's helped the markets.
As you mentioned, if the U.S. economy is doing fine, one of the world's strongest, so why is it necessary for the U.S. Federal Reserve, to cut the interest rate?
I think people call this potential easing cycle an insurance cycle to assume that the business growth momentum and the economic growth momentum can be sustained and we extend the cycle. So while we are late cycle and we've had a long run, I do think a modest easing can be accommodative. Inflation remains low even in the U.S. And then I think they'll kind of watch and see how the data and how the economic growth is going, and then maybe see by December whether another cut is needed. I don't think it's going to be a significant easing cycle. I think just enough to continue to have a good moderate growth environment without hopefully overstimulating inflation and then having to repeat the are we overheating fears in a year.
Do you think that the Fed caves into Trump's demand because he's calling for the Fed to cut the interest rate and also resorting to the QE if possible in order to jumpstart the U.S. economy?
Yeah, I think there's lots of speculation around that. Trump obviously likes to express his personal opinions in the media, but the Fed has always maintained a somewhat independent structure towards that. I think Powell, being he's kind of a new head of the Federal Reserve, is learning some of the intricacies of the economy and how he communicates. And so I do think what's different than past regimes and even globally is central banks understand how fast the data comes in, how fast it can change. You've got a lot more global macro headwinds, tariffs, as well as things like Brexit and oil issues. And so I think there's many more global data points that you have to consider. Most of these economies now are more globally connected, as you see with China. So much of the supply chain and manufacturing is done there, and so there's definitely an imbalance between imports and exports. And so I think all the central banks are a lot more proactive in watching how the data is coming in. And so to not send us into a recession, I think they're much more mindful of being data dependent every month, every quarter, and then making gradual adjustments before. Where in the past, I think they were a little bit slower to react. They were always kind of behind the curve when they would do cuts and rate hikes. And I think you've got a kind of a new type of Federal Reserve that's much more looking at the data, always trying to make adjustments to the dials and knobs on the instrument panel to hopefully prolong the economic growth cycle that we've had so strongly in the last, 7 years.